and welcome to my wrap up for the month of February. I had a pretty successful reading month, reading 4 books in total, so let's just jump straight in. Now, the first book that I read this month is definitely one of my book nemesis. I have talked before about this book and how intimidated I have been by the size of it. But in January I joined an online book club called the Mother Bookers, and this was the first chosen book, so I couldn't avoid but pick it up, and that is of course The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. And I have never had such conflicting feelings about a book before. At 860 pages, it is absolutely gigantic. I can easily see why this book is so loved by so many people, but for me, just something didn't quite connect. We basically follow the story of a young boy called Theo Decker who suffers a terrible tragedy when his mother is killed in a terrorist attack, and this book follows his subsequent years as he goes through being a teenager and as he struggles to find his place once he has essentially been left on his own in the big wide world. And tied into all of that is this connection that Theo and his mother had to a painting, a very famous painting known as the Goldfinch. Now, as I said, I can 100% see why people love this book. The plot was rich and detailed, the writing was absolutely beautiful and in places just completely exquisite. But for me, there was just a real disconnect between me as the reader and the characters. I didn't connect with any of the characters, and I basically felt like I spent 800 pages or over 800 pages reading as Theo made bad choice after bad choice, and it basically got to the point where I just didn't even care anymore what happened to him. I will say that the ending very much redeemed itself, and I enjoyed the ending probably the most out of the whole of the plot. But I do feel like this book could probably have been half the length that it was. I think I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and as I said, I really enjoyed Donna Tartt's writing and I would be very interested to pick up some of her other books, but this particular story, this particular book just didn't quite work for me. The next book that I read in the month of February was Walking Wounded by Anna Franklin Osborne, and this was an ebook which was sent to me for the purpose of a review, and I have reviewed it in full over on my blog, so I'll just quickly summarise it here. This is basically a story about a family. It covers several generations of the same family, and it tells the story from the armistice at the end of the First World War right through to the 1950s with the £10 POMs, so the mass emigration of people from the UK over to Australia. The protagonist is a young girl, or the main protagonist is a young girl called May, who is born at the end of the First World War, so we kind of watch as she tries to find her place, as she tries to deal with the outbreak of the Second World War, and then as she makes the decision with her family to move over to Australia. I thought that the premise of this book sounded really interesting. It's basically an exploration or a look at how it wasn't just the men who went to war that were affected by the war, but also the women who were left at home and how they had to deal with their own battles and face their own injuries, physical or otherwise, and then also in how they dealt with the men coming home and how the relationships had altered, how the family dynamics changed and all that kind of thing. So the premise on the surface sounded so interesting to me, and I was really looking forward to picking it up, particularly because it's such a short book at only 156 pages. But again, there was just something slightly off. I only gave this 3 out of 5 stars. It goes through the different time periods incredibly quickly, which you might think makes sense because it's such a short book. But for me, each chapter was incredibly short and it read more like a series of Polaroid moments than an actual novel. I would recommend checking it out if you think that it sounds interesting. It was a really quick read, it was a really easy read, and I did enjoy it. The next book that I read was I'm Travelling Alone by Samuel Bjork. I don't actually have my physical copy of it because I lent it to a friend, which I think tells you how much I enjoyed it. This is basically a debut novel from a Nordic noir author, and we follow the story of 2 detectives. So we have Detective Holger, who has kind of almost like Sherlock style abilities, so she can dissect information very quickly, she can see patterns in things, but she's a little bit detached from her colleagues following a tragedy in her own life. And we have Detective Munch, who is kind of the big, solid, older male detective who kind of brings Holger in, and together they make this specialist detective team in Oslo in Norway. So we begin the book by learning that Holger has gone off. She's decided that she doesn't want to be a detective anymore, but a serial killer arrives, and the first that we find of it is a young 6-year-old girl hanging from a tree, dressed ready for school with a tag attached to her which says "I'm travelling alone." So this is going to be a series of novels called the Holger and Munch series, and I really enjoyed it. It was so good in a spine tingly, super creepy, don't know if I can actually carry on reading this kind of way. I think that you can definitely tell that the book has been translated from Norwegian. There were certain parts of it where the prose almost read a little bit stilted, but to be honest, that didn't take away from my enjoyment of the story at all. I thought that it was creepy, I thought that it was fast paced. I did eventually twig who the killer was, but it was really close to the end, which I absolutely loved, because I really don't enjoy books where you know from the beginning who the culprit is going to be. So I enjoyed it from that respect. I liked it's your classic kind of detective story in that the detectives are not squeaky clean, they're a little bit morally ambiguous, and I really like that. I know that it's very typical of that type of book, but I really enjoyed it. I thought that in this particular book it was done really well. Obviously it wasn't a perfect read, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars for that, but as a debut novel and as a thriller, a creepy psychological thriller type book, I thought that it was really good, and I would highly recommend it. Then the final book that I read this month was A Long Way Gone by Ishmael Bey. This is Ishmael Bey's memoirs of his time as a boy soldier in Sierra Leone, and picking this book up, I knew that it was going to be a really difficult read, and it absolutely was. So this basically follows Ishmael Bey's story as his village is attacked by rebels. As he is displaced, he loses his family. He takes up with a group of boys, and they're basically just trying to keep one step ahead of the rebels whilst also trying to find their families. Eventually he is picked up by the government army and forced into being a boy soldier to fight against the rebels, which was an interesting thing that I didn't actually realise. I fully expected that he would end up fighting for the rebels, so it was a surprise to learn that actually he was conscripted and forced to fight for the government army, and that there were boys as young as 7 in the government army actually fighting against the rebels as well, simply because they didn't have enough soldiers to kind of spread out and actually effectively fight the rebel army. We're very much getting this from the perspective of Ishmael as he was at that age, and it's less about his experiences within the army as it is about his personal journey to reconcile himself with the things that he was made to do, how he ended up there, how he held on to his humanity, and then how he's gone on to live his life as an adult while still being obviously haunted by the things that he was involved in his time in Sierra Leone. I think that as a non-fiction memoir, it's incredibly hard hitting, and it's incredibly important to read. I don't think that asking a young boy to go back over some of the horrific things that he was asked to do is necessarily an easy thing, and so it's understandable that you get a very surface level look, and he touches on just every now and then some of the things that he was asked to do. But this is very much more about his story of redemption and self-forgiveness. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I think that if you wanted a more in-depth look at exactly what child soldiers had to go through, then this probably isn't the book for you. But in terms of a eye-opening look at some of the atrocities that they were forced to carry out, and at how one boy has managed to carry on with his life and cope with some of the things that he was asked to do, then I think that it's very enlightening, and I did cry, as I thought that I might, and I would recommend it. It's a really short read, it's a really moving read, and it's an important one as well, I think. So there you go, they are the books that I read during the month of February. As I said, a little bit of a mixed bag. I'm currently reading Empire of Storms by Sarah J Maas, which again is a huge book. I seem to be having this thing where all I want to do is read really big books, but I hope that whatever you are reading, you are enjoying it. Do let me know in the comments section below. Let me know if you read any of the books that I read this month, and we can have a chat about it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all soon.